Okay, so I'm going to ask Jose to come up on stage. Jose Arrieta is the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Acquisition at HHS. So it's kind of a little bit of an awkward thing coming up. Let's hope for the best. Okay, so. Yes. All right. All right. So Jose, we're so excited to have you, and this is our probably the warmest fireside chat I've ever had. It's like 80 degrees outside. But before we get started, I also want to thank the team and everyone who's been involved in putting this event together. And Mike will, at a later point, talk about our next event, but mark your calendars for July 17th. Make sure that you tweet about our events, so don't put your phones away. Take pictures, shoofies. Shoofies, yes. Okay, let's. Jose, you and I talked a little bit about blockchain and acquisition overall yesterday, and you have been a huge proponent for blockchain. So many think of use cases in the financial sector. We think of cryptocurrencies when it comes to blockchain. But you actually created the first proof of concept of a blockchain-enabled system in the federal government. So can you talk about that and lay out some of the key takeaways from that process?
Yeah, I mean, so I was exposed to blockchain while working at the Treasury, and in particular getting access to the large banking institutions that were looking at it from a back-end implementation perspective. And when you work at the Treasury, it's very easy to kind of have those engagements. And you know, historically in my career, I built enrollment vetting, adjudication, and redress systems in the national security space, which are very much about collecting data, analyzing it, and kind of sharing it with the intelligence community. And what I realized is that blockchain as a technology is an enabling technology. You can almost use it as, you know, the sticky hands that your kids buy that you can kind of slap against the wall and they stick to the wall, and then you peel it off the wall and it has all the dirt and grime that's on the wall. You can use blockchain to actually layer over existing applications from a technology perspective. You can use an API gateway to access the data in those existing applications, and you can allow your existing applications to operate and deliver mission, and you can modernize by stacking technology. You can modernize on top of your blockchain because now you have a data layer that you've created some structure, leveraging machine learning or as a mechanism to actually extract data from your existing applications. You have this data layer, whether you're using Hyperledger or Ethereum, and you can actually modernize by using machine learning microservices, robotic processing automation microservices, cognitive intelligence microservices off the top of your data layer. So your existing application stack, it doesn't have to be turned off. It's not impacting your existing mission space, but you're able to modernize either one business process at a time or entire functions of applications at a time. And that is very powerful. You know, having gone through multiple modernization efforts, you typically have to raise a bunch of capital, and you go on a 3-year adventure where you're collecting requirements and you're going to do one large contract and you're going to kind of build a new system all at once. Well, now you have the actual flexibility to, in real time, rebuild an existing business system in a risk-controlled way, one business process at a time, off of a data layer. That is my attraction to blockchain and the technology in particular. It is not so much about trust in an entity that I'm doing business with. It is more about trust in the set of data that I'm actually receiving, that I'm actually accessing. And I know a bunch of folks that have been around a while says, well, trash in is trash out. Right? You know, from a data perspective, if it's bad coming in, it's going to be bad for your outcome. But the way that I look at it is if you take a sample set of that data, you create structure around the characteristics of that are acceptable and have been organized correctly, you can apply that to all the data that you're extracting from these systems. Anything that doesn't meet those standardizations are flagged so that you can look at it. You can go back and actually look at it with human eyes. But you can actually get to a data layer and start proofing some of the functionality quicker. So the experience that I've had with blockchain and what we did when I was at GSA, and I'm no longer there, as you guys know, is we were able to leverage blockchain and kind of layer it over 22 different acquisition systems. We were able to take an acquisition process that on average took 110 days. We were able to recreate the user interfaces of the data we receive, because what we realized is the 300 users that were actually awarding these contracts were entering the same information multiple times throughout the process through multiple different systems. So we created one user interface, collected 90% of the information that we needed to collect on the front end, and then we identified choke points in our business process, and we automated that. And by automating those choke points, we were able to cut, in the proof, we were able to cut the acquisition life cycle time from 110 days to 10 days. So I think the technology is very powerful if you think of it as a foundational technology that's an enabler for things like machine learning and cognitive intelligence. I think that the technologies go hand in hand. And the other thing that I would mention, and just kind of interrupt if you have another question, I'm very informal. The other thing that I would keep in mind is there's a different pricing structure when you do this type of work, right? You're actually structuring the way that you execute in a different way. You have to actually look at your existing business process, and you have to say, okay, if we didn't have any technology constraints at all, how would we modernize? So what is our process? What parts of our process are driven by technology constraints? And I'll give you an example of that. And then how can we modernize? And a simple example that I always use is if I add 2 decimal points to an application, right, whether it's a COT product or something that I've built in-house, I have to do the engineering work to change those 2 decimal points in every system that I interface with. Then I have to run IV&V on that entire stack to make sure that functionally it works. That's why we're spending so much money in O&M. Now let's kind of think about what I just said. If I have a data layer with data that's accurate, and I'm just building microservices off that data layer to drive the specific outcomes that I want, all I have to do is deconstruct that microservice and rebuild another microservice that gives me the new outcome that I want. So, I think blockchain gives you the ability to create agility in your mission space and to be flexible in a way that allows you to change as it relates to different reporting requirements, as it relates to different functional things that may appear in the landscape in the future. And that's what's attracted me to it, and that's kind of the way that I think about it. So I get away from the discussion around crypto, and I'm more focusing on it as a high-powered middleware that enables automated insight, automated business process. So either an automated analytics suite or an automated or automating sections of business process that are administrative in nature and take a significant amount of time.
What do you think are some of the misconceptions when it comes to agencies trying to implement blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that if I were a company and I was trying to target an agency, and I know you guys all have your pipelines and you kind of develop your pipelines of how you target work. I think there's a more important question to ask first. And it really, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, do they have a centralized IT function or do they have a decentralized IT function? And I was talking about this with somebody while I was drinking coffee when I came in. So is the IT and the delivery of IT directly associated with the program office and the mission space? Or is it a centralized function that people pay into, and that centralized IT office actually delivers IT capability to multiple programs? And for me, if I was trying to do anything related to IT modernization, I would target the agencies that had technology aligned directly in the mission space with the programs and funding tied to it. Because if I'm being driven by a mission space, I'm much more likely to take risk. I'm much more likely to want to modernize to drive an outcome that's related to my mission space. I don't want somebody dying from a terrorist attack. If my mission space is terrorism and I think there's a risk and I have some money, I'm more likely to try something new if I'm directly in the program shop with money and a technology capability. So I think the first misconception is from an industry perspective. If you're actually targeting to do any type of modernization work, I think you have to segregate how much effort you put into modernizing on the basis of where the program or the function that you're targeting actually sits. If it's decentralized and aligned with the mission space, I think they're going to be more open to modernization. They're going to be more flexible, more agile. And that doesn't mean that a centralized IT function is not agile and not innovative. It just means that they have more stakeholders and more consensus that has to occur in order to deliver whatever the outcome is they're delivering, and that by nature restrains them. I think the biggest misconception about blockchain is every single person here that hasn't really kind of delved into this topic before will go and Google search blockchain and you'll read a ton of articles on Bitcoin. You know, Bitcoin is an application that exists on top of blockchain technology. It's an application. It is a single application of the technology. And what I just described to you is a model for leveraging the technology for a different set of applications. And I think the biggest misconception is that you have to use the crypto aspects, proof of work, proof of stake, of blockchain and a network where you're trying to create trust between two individuals that don't know one another. And what I just told you is I'm using a non-crypto I'm using blockchain in a non-crypto method. I know the individuals I'm doing business with because it's easy to know an industry partner, right? You got a tax ID, you pay taxes, you have to register with the IRS, right? So I know who you are, and I'm using it so that I can have trust in the data and a record of the data that you submitted to me. And I'm not using proof of work and proof of stake, which generates a ton of energy costs, right? I'm using something called proof of authority. And proof of authority doesn't use a ton of energy cost, and I don't need proof of work, proof of stake, because I don't have to engage with an entity that I don't know. I already know you. And I think the biggest misconception is don't go and Google it and expect to find a description of, I think about 3 months ago, I started to see articles posted on LinkedIn about stacking the technology, stacking blockchain technology in the method that I described. We did it last year. And there's a guy in the health space in particular that started to tag me in articles about stacking these technologies in the health space. I had not seen any articles about stacking the technology in the method I described until 3 months ago. Not to say that they didn't exist. So I think the biggest misconception is everybody applies the rules of Bitcoin and how the application of Bitcoin functions to the application of blockchain in general, and that's not the case. And it's unfortunate because the technology can, it is a simple method to kind of move you to the cloud in a risk-controlled manner, one business process at a time, without disrupting your existing delivery of capabilities, and 100% accessing data to get you out of the O&M death spiral that we're all in. That's a pretty interesting opportunity, right? But nobody has actually written or documented how to actually implement it. They just focus on what's written on Bitcoin. So I think that's the biggest misconception, that if you're thinking about using the technology and you're an agency leader, you have to get away from that misconception to identify the actual true value.
So for the next question, you cannot pick GSA, but where have you seen the best use cases or the most interesting use cases for blockchain in the federal space, especially as it relates to health?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm gonna pivot away from the other federal agencies, and we can maybe go back to it. But I think the most interesting use case as it relates to health is there's a company that provides a bunch of lab equipment for diagnostic tools, and I have a friend that actually works there, and I've known him for years, and I'm always talking to him about blockchain, and they're trying to create IoT-enabled lab devices, and they provide 90% of the lab devices in the world for the specific areas that they're focused in on. And their biggest issue is rationalizing and kind of aggregating the data as it comes in, right? So they're using an API gateway, they want to create a data lake, and they want to run some type of diagnostic off the data that comes in, and they want to resell it as a service back to their clients. And what they're running into is they're going to kind of be backed into a corner by whatever specific software or technology that they use to actually ingest all of that data. And they realize that that's a fundamental issue for them long term, because every application that they build off that software stack is going to drive additional costs for them if they have to change anything as it relates to pivoting to their customer. And so the most interesting application that I've seen is their push into blockchain and them thinking about actually taking blockchain and using that instead of a software, and then building interfaces with COT technologies to do the analysis as it relates to specific customers as microservices off of their data layer. And for those of you that are thinking, well, how could you handle that type of volume? Everything doesn't exist on the blockchain. You're tagging it, pointing to it, you're pointing to the data on the chain, and you're storing it in an off-chain database, whether you're using a distributed database or whether you're using something like Mongo, which is, everybody in the room knows Mongo. So I think that's the most interesting use case. Now, that for me. Now, from a government perspective, The most interesting use case that I've heard of is actually as it relates to identity. And I won't get into the specifics of kind of where it's being done, but I think describing it is really important for everyone in the audience. So, there are about 2 billion people in the world that don't have identity. And when you don't have identity, there's no ability for you to have any type of, to drive any type of economics for yourself in the future. I mean, you literally don't exist. And the way that this government is using it is they're doing iris scan, thumbprint scan, via phone, right? They're tagging it, tagging iris and thumbprint, loading it up to a cloud environment, and they've actually just created a digital identity that tags to an identity card that they purchase, right? So now I have a low-cost way to actually generate identity for an individual that's based on two things that you cannot change. It's tagged to a credential because we're all comfortable with credentials. I don't really need the credential, but and somebody that's that impoverished probably doesn't have the ability to actually have a cell phone, but it could be tagged to a cell phone or a watch, digitally encrypted. And now I have the ability to open a bank account. I have the ability to create an economic record. I have the ability to own something and prove that I own it and tag it directly to an encrypted location that's directly aligned with my identity. So I think that the use cases for blockchain as it relates to identity are extremely interesting to me because identity is the basis for almost everything that we do. If one of you wants access, say one of you worked with me at HHS and you wanted access to our system, what would I do? Well, the first thing I would do, and by the way, this is all manual, and this is like a nightmare to go through this process, right? So the first thing I would do is I would say, do you have a security clearance? Check, yes. Did you take the appropriate training? This is a human being looking this up. Did you take the appropriate training? Yes, I took the appropriate training. Did you sign off on the waiver? Yes, I did. Okay, now I'm going to create a username and password. Imagine if I could automate that. So instead of taking 2 weeks to give you access, it just took a few seconds. And I could do that on the basis of identity. And the training that you took and the waivers that you signed were all tagged to a unique identifier that was associated with you as an individual. And you start to see some of those uses in state government across the US and other places in Europe where they're using blockchain as an identity enabler. And I think that is the most interesting use case for me. And I think that's where we'll have the most transformative effect.
So we have a few minutes, so we're going to open up the floor to audience questions. We have Matt over there with a mic. Yes. Questions? Here's your opportunity. Here, up front, Matt. Yeah. Run.
Hi, Steve Bird from Unison.
We met on the way in, Steve, so there's no tough questions, okay?
Yeah. So I've got a softball for you. So HHS has this multi-agency vehicle called Spark that CMS is a frequent user of. Is there effort to get other agencies to also leverage this vehicle within HHS, or to what extent?
Yeah, I mean, I think Spark is a CMS-specific vehicle. I think we're always open to other agencies within HHS, other OpDevs, I'm trying to learn the verbiage still, other OpDevs within HHS to leverage existing vehicles that we've created. And that's typically driven through, we have regular meetings within HHS where we'll bring the HCAs in and have them talk to one another about different needs that they have, different contract offerings that they have. And that's typically driven through those venues. I think that, as it relates to my focus, before I can do anything as it relates to pushing the HCAs to use specific contracting vehicles or even trying to persuade them to do that, I have to create the operational capability from a delivery perspective to actually empower our 1102s with the data and the analytical insights they actually need to negotiate contracts. And I also have to look at how can I take existing business processes that every 1102 performs, by the way, whether it's in HHS or whether it's in another agency, and how can I automate those things? Because if I can drive that value for the 1102s, if I can lessen the processing time for contracting and I can give them the analytical insights they need so they are holding it with them when they go to the negotiation, I can speed up the process and I can give them a bigger seat at the table as it relates to marketing a vehicle like that to the rest of the program community that exists within HHS. So from a priority perspective, I'm focused on more of the empowerment aspect of the acquisition professional at HHS, because I think empowerment through data, insights, and a faster process actually drives the uses of some of the vehicles that we've put in place.
Okay, one more. Sorry, Derek.
Hi, I'm John Scott from Defense Health Agency, and I got to admit, I'm just learning about what blockchain is. In fact, I'm probably one of the people in the room who doesn't know what Mongo is exactly. Okay, I'm not the only one. No, but from what you said, it seems to confirm something I've been suspecting, and that's this, that a problem in the health IT space that blockchain may be very applicable to is preserving integrity and provenance of data as it crosses the personal controlled digital space. So if people have PHRs and collect data from more than one covered entity and then share it back, we need to be able to preserve the authenticity of the data as it traverses that space. Does that sound like the right idea?
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly the idea. I think it's important since this is the government CIO kind of organization, I think it's important just to kind of articulate quickly the architecture that I'm talking about from a delivery perspective, right? So, and I don't want to talk technology, but I think understanding that, like, yes, you can do this, but you have to think about, like, the foundation that you're going to put in place to facilitate this. And this is just some ideas. I'm not saying that this is perfectly baked, but I think it provides some insight for you guys. So, you're talking about an API gateway, right? Why? Because I want to accept structured, unstructured, maybe some mobile data, maybe video, right? I want to be able to accept multiple forms of data. You're talking about receiving it and tagging it directly to something that I'm calling Hyperledger or Ethereum, which is a blockchain-based OS, right? Now, all I'm doing is tagging it on that chain so that I have provenance, right? And I have a record of immutable, that's immutable from what I received. Then I'm dropping it, the heavy stuff, I'm dropping the video and the pictures, I'm dropping it off into some database of some form, right? I'm using Mongo because it's a relational database, it's really good with unstructured, and it's a very flexible, scalable tool. On top of accessing the actual chain itself, I'm running an analytics suite, and that's where I'm building a construct of microservices to drive analytics off of all the data that I'm receiving. So if it's terms and conditions across 1 million contracts, if it's prices paid across 1 million contracts, I'm actually now using cognitive intelligence and machine learning to analyze the range of terms and conditions that exist for software license purchases and the price associated with what was paid for those purchases across the entire portfolio in real time, right? I'm also running a process suite where I'm automating simple business processes. Maybe it's financial responsibility determination of a firm. Maybe it's reps and search checks. These things take time. We have contracting people that actually do this work. I'm basically saying, well, why don't we just automate that? Flag anything that's borderline. Contracting officer, contract specialist can jump in and take a look. If it's not borderline, which 80-90% of them aren't, it passes through and we don't have to spend 10 to 12 days actually doing that work, right? So this is the architecture that we're talking about. We have a layer of identity management. Every entity that comes in has to have an identity. We're using provenance and immutability to track all the activity as it relates to that data that's coming in from that specific company. Remember, I still have this API gateway wrap, right? And I'm using a load stabilizer on the backside. Because if I do, and I'm not saying we all would want to, but if I do have to connect with the external world, whether it's Amazon, whether it's a private individual that wants to share their health data, right? I'm using a load stabilizer, so the microservice itself that accepts that data and tags it exists. The load stabilizer is there in case entity that maybe doesn't want me to operate pushes a ton of data at my network to try and crash it, right? That is the arc. That is, I'm sure there's improvements on that, but I think it's important that we talk about that is the foundation for how you modernize. That is the foundation for how you get off of a legacy IT stack in a risk-controlled way. And you can do that in a very low-cost way because you don't have to build all that functionality at once. But I think you have to understand that, like tonight for dinner, I'm going to have steak, I'm going to have, whatever, some rice, hopefully some vegetables, and a drink, right? And that is kind of what the entire plate is for when you get to where you want to go from a modernization perspective. Now, you can just start with the API gateway, the ledger, and the DB, accept information on and build off your analytic tools. But from a scalability perspective, you have to think about it in that perspective. I am no longer creating a box where data comes in and the system processes work. I am inverting that box. I am exposing all the data, and I'm saying to at customer agencies, I'm saying to individuals that I'm interacting with, you can access the data and build a microservice for the insight that you need. I'm going to control the immutability and provenance of the data. I'm going to put security apparatus around the data that actually exists. I'm going to run some analytics for you as a microservice to drive value for you. But I'm also exposing the data if you need to build a microservice. That's why it's an agile, flexible architecture. And I think it's very important that I'm not saying what I just said is perfect. I'm sure there's a bunch of different things we'd have to fill in along the way. But it's a low-cost way to think about modernization to kind of evolve in that direction.
Well, so little time, so many things to discuss. How can people get in touch with you if they want to continue the conversation? Are you sticking around?
I'll be around for a little bit. I do have to walk back. I walked here. I thought it was a lot on the map. It looked a lot closer, and I ended up way down there.
Nice morning cardio.
And for my wife says you talk about technology all the time, but you're the person that when you use the GPS you get lost because it'll say like turn here, and I start to analyze it, and then I drive past it, and then you're driving in a circle. I will be around. You can just send me an email. I'm pretty much the only person in the global with the name Jose Arrieta. And if you, for some reason, it's just jose.arrieta@HHS. And if for some reason it bounces back or you misspell it, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I try to meet with as many industry folks as I can. We don't do contracts by ourselves. We do contracts with industry partners. We don't do contracts for fun. We do contracts to support programs. So if you're not regularly engaged with your program folks, and if you're not regularly engaged with your industry partners, you're probably not doing your job if you're in the role that I'm at. So I try to set aside time on Friday and Monday to meet with industry folks. Doesn't mean that we'll be able to meet right away because I do take a lot of those meetings, but I'd love to connect with any of you and share any ideas or brainstorm on anything that you want to share.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jose.
Thanks,
we
guys.
appreciate it. Thank you.